I spent most of my professional life learning to treat words as indicators, not decorations. In intelligence work, rhetoric is never just rhetoric, it is data. When a president of the United States says openly that America will run another country until a transition occurs, that is not an offhand remark. That is a declaration of intent, whether the lawyers have caught up to it or not. I have watched administrations stumble into strategic disasters precisely because they failed to appreciate how language reshapes operational reality. When Donald Trump stated that the United States would run Venezuela until a safe, proper, and judicious transition could be arranged, he crossed the conceptual line that American officials have historically tried to avoid acknowledging out loud. Regime change has always been wrapped in euphemism, supporting democracy, restoring order, protecting civilians. Saying we will run the country strips away that camouflage. For intelligence professionals, that phrasing triggers immediate questions. Who governs? Under what authority? For how long? And enforced by what means? Those are not theoretical issues. They determine force posture, rules of engagement, and intelligence collection priorities. What struck me immediately was not just the statement itself, but the confidence with which it was delivered, as if the feasibility were already settled. That tells me something important. Intelligence assessments, warning about Venezuelan nationalism, regional backlash, or institutional collapse either failed to penetrate the decision-making circle or were discounted as noise. I have seen this pattern before. Intelligence is not falsified outright, it is sidelined. Analysts are asked narrower questions, timelines are compressed, and worst-case scenarios are labeled implausible until they arrive on schedule. The justification offered drug trafficking, narco-terrorism, and the capture of Nicolas Maduro was framed as law enforcement amplified by military power. That fusion is not accidental. It is a legal workaround that allows policymakers to blur the line between arrest and invasion. I watched similar logic applied after 9/11 when counterterrorism authorities expanded into global military campaigns without coherent end states. Venezuela fits that template perfectly. A weak state, a demonized leader, and an American public conditioned to accept extraordinary measures if framed as security necessity. The strategic consequence of such language is immediate. Once you declare that you will run a country, you inherit responsibility for everything that follows: governance failures, economic collapse, insurgency, and regional destabilization. Intelligence cannot fix that after the fact. Its role is preventive, not cosmetic. When policy ignores that distinction, intelligence becomes fiction, crafted to justify what has already been done rather than to inform what should not be done. This is how credibility erodes. Not in one dramatic failure, but in a series of confident declarations that mistake dominance for control and power for foresight. I have learned the hard way that empires don't collapse because they lack intelligence. They collapse because they stop listening to it. I worked Venezuela as an intelligence problem long before it became fashionable again in Washington. And what always struck me was how consistently policymakers overstated both the threat and the opportunity. Inside the intelligence community, Venezuela was never assessed as a peer adversary or even a regional military power. Its armed forces were fragmented, politicized, undermaintained, and deeply penetrated by corruption. That did not make them harmless, but it made them brittle, unpredictable, and prone to fracture under pressure. Those characteristics are not assets when you are contemplating control. They are liabilities that generate chaos. Intelligence reporting was clear on this point for years. Venezuelan military cohesion depended less on ideology than on patronage, networks, fear, and survival instincts. Remove the center abruptly and you don't get order, you get fragmentation. The public narrative leaned heavily on drug trafficking and narco-terrorism, particularly the claim that Venezuela functioned as a hub poisoning American cities. Intelligence assessments were more restrained. Yes, elements of the Venezuelan state facilitated trafficking routes, often in cooperation with Colombian criminal organizations and corrupt regional officials. But Venezuela was a transit zone, not the engine of the global drug trade. Mexico remained the central node. something intelligence reporting never obscured. Inflating Venezuela's role served a rhetorical purpose. It converted a complex regional criminal ecosystem into a single villain that could be neutralized through decisive action. That simplification made for good speeches, but bad strategy. On Nicolas Maduro himself, intelligence never portrayed him as a mastermind or a strategic thinker. He was assessed as a survivor, propped up by Cuban intelligence assistance, internal repression, and the absence of a credible alternative that could unify the country. Removing him did not automatically resolve Venezuela's structural collapse. Hyperinflation, institutional rot, and mass emigration were already baked in. Analysts warn that decapitation without a negotiated political framework risked accelerating state failure rather than reversing it. That warning was not speculative. It was drawn from case studies ranging from Iraq to Libya. What troubled me most was how intelligence caveats were treated as footnotes rather than central findings. Policymakers gravitated toward best-case scenarios: minimal resistance, rapid stabilization, grateful populations. Those scenarios existed in the reporting, but only as conditional outcomes requiring massive sustained engagement and legitimacy that could not be imposed externally. The intelligence community did its job by laying out probabilities, not fantasies. The problem was not a lack of information. It was selective hearing. When leaders declare that the United States will run another country, intelligence stops being an advisory function and becomes a cleanup crew. Analysts are asked to map threats that inevitably emerge rather than to prevent the strategic error that created them. I've seen that transformation before, and it always ends the same way. Intelligence becomes reactive, credibility erodes, and the gap between what was known and what was done grows wider with each passing month. I have watched mission creep unfold often enough to recognize it early. It rarely announces itself as escalation. It presents as continuity. In the Venezuela case, the shift from sanctions to something approaching seizure was not a sudden break, but the logical endpoint of years of incremental decisions that were never subjected to a single, honest strategic audit. Each step was justified on its own terms: financial pressure, diplomatic isolation, indictments, asset freezes, but taken together, they formed a trajectory that pointed unmistakably toward control rather than influence. Sanctions were sold as a non-kinetic alternative to war, a way to coerce behavioral change without bloodshed. Intelligence reporting consistently showed their real effect. Sanctions weakened state capacity faster than they weakened regime loyalty. They hollowed out institutions, incentivized smuggling, and empowered the very criminal networks Washington claimed to be dismantling. None of this was hidden. Analysts flagged repeatedly that sanctions without a negotiated off-ramp rarely produce orderly transitions. They produce black markets and desperation. But sanctions had political utility. They allowed policymakers to claim action while postponing accountability for outcomes. The turn toward law enforcement was the next step. Indicting Maduro and senior figures reframed Venezuela from a foreign policy problem into a criminal enterprise. That move was strategically consequential. Once you label a head of state as a fugitive criminal, negotiation becomes politically toxic, even if intelligence assessments indicate that negotiation is the least destabilizing option. I saw this dynamic after 9/11, when counterterrorism authorities were stretched to justify actions that were fundamentally political and military. The language of justice provides moral cover, but it also narrows policy choices. What followed was predictable. Sanctions failed to produce collapse on Washington's timeline. Diplomatic recognition of alternative leaders failed to generate internal legitimacy. At that point, escalation becomes less a decision than an inertia-driven slide. Intelligence agencies are tasked with supporting contingency planning, a phrase that sounds cautious but often masks an assumption that intervention is inevitable. Questions shift from whether to act to how to manage the consequences of acting. Declaring that the United States will run Venezuela completes that progression. It formalizes what had been implicit, that economic warfare and legal pressure were preparatory phases, not endpoints. From an intelligence perspective, this is where warning lights flash. Running a country is not a tactical problem, it is a generational commitment. It requires security, governance, legitimacy, and resources measured in decades, not news cycles. Intelligence can estimate risks, but it cannot manufacture consent or repair shattered institutions on command. The hard lesson here is institutional, not ideological. When policy advances in increments small enough to avoid debate, strategy disappears. Intelligence becomes a tool for managing consequences rather than preventing folly. By the time leaders say openly what they have been doing implicitly, the point of no return is already close, and history suggests it is rarely reversible. One of the most durable myths in American strategic culture is the idea of the clean intervention, the belief that overwhelming power applied decisively and briefly can reset a political system without dragging the intervening force into the wreckage that follows. I have read this assumption embedded in intelligence taskings, policy memos, and war plans for decades. It survives despite an overwhelming record of failure. Venezuela, as framed in recent declarations, fits squarely into that mythological tradition. The intelligence community has long warned that interventions justified as temporary measures almost never remain temporary. The reason is structural, not moral. Once you remove or neutralize a regime, you assume responsibility for the vacuum. In Venezuela's case, that vacuum would not be theoretical. The country's institutions were already degraded by years of economic collapse, sanctions, pressure, and political polarization. Intelligence assessments consistently noted that there was no cohesive national bureaucracy waiting in the wings, no unified opposition with administrative depth, and no security apparatus capable of maintaining order without coercion. A clean transition required actors that did not exist. I have seen this logic play out before. In Iraq, the assumption was that removing Saddam Hussein would allow latent institutions to reassert themselves. Intelligence reporting warned that de-Baathification would shatter what remained of state capacity. Those warnings were acknowledged and then ignored. Libya followed a similar script. The intervention was sold as limited, humanitarian, and precise. Intelligence later documented how quickly that narrative collapsed into militia warfare, regional arms proliferation, and long-term instability. Each case was treated as unique. The pattern was not. What makes the Venezuela case especially troubling is the casual confidence with which control is discussed. Saying the United States will run the country assumes that control is primarily a function of force. Intelligence professionals know better. Control is a function of legitimacy, logistics, and local buy-in. Force can remove obstacles. It cannot create consent. Every assessment I have seen on Latin America underscores the sensitivity to sovereignty, historical memory of U.S. intervention, and the rapid mobilization of nationalist resistance when external control becomes explicit. The strategic consequence of believing in clean intervention is not just failure abroad, but distortion at home. Intelligence estimates become optimistic by design. Worst-case scenarios are labeled unlikely because acknowledging them would undermine the policy rationale. Over time, analysts internalize these preferences not because they are dishonest, but because institutions reward alignment with power. This is how intelligence becomes fiction, not through fabrication, but through selective emphasis. The hard lesson is brutal and repetitive. There is no such thing as a clean intervention when the objective shifts from influence to control. The moment you claim responsibility for another country's trajectory, you inherit its fractures, its resentments, and its future failures. Intelligence can map those risks in advance, but it cannot prevent leaders from believing their own myths. History shows that when they do, the bill always comes due, and it is never paid quickly. There is a moment in every policy cycle when intelligence stops shaping decisions and starts justifying them. I recognize that moment because I lived through it. It arrives quietly, not with an order to falsify analysis, but with a narrowing of acceptable questions. Analysts are no longer asked what is likely to happen. They are asked how to make a chosen outcome work. In the Venezuela case, that pressure was visible long before anyone spoke openly about running the country. Intelligence under pressure does not collapse into lies, it collapses into compliance. Products become shorter, caveats are pushed to annexes, and probability language is softened to avoid friction with policymakers who are already committed. I have watched this dynamic distort assessments across multiple administrations. The signals are familiar. Dissenting views are labeled unhelpful, red team analyses are quietly sidelined, and senior officials gravitate toward intelligence that confirms momentum rather than challenges it. Over time, the analytic culture adapts, not out of malice, but out of institutional survival. On Venezuela, the pressure points were obvious. Policymakers wanted assurance that intervention would be limited, that resistance would be minimal, and that regional backlash could be managed. Intelligence reporting offered none of those guarantees. What it did offer were conditional outcomes that depended on legitimacy, sustained engagement, and regional cooperation. Those conditions were politically inconvenient. As a result, intelligence was treated as a menu rather than a warning system, with optimistic assumptions elevated and structural risks treated as manageable variables. This is not how intelligence is supposed to function. Its value lies in its resistance to desire. When intelligence becomes aligned with intent, it loses that resistance. Analysts begin to internalize policy preferences, not because they are ordered to, but because they understand which judgments advance careers and which stall them. The result is a feedback loop in which policy confidence grows precisely as analytic caution recedes. By the time reality intrudes, the system has already convinced itself that failure was unforeseeable. The strategic consequence is profound. When intelligence is pressured into support mode, leaders lose their last reliable check against self-deception. Decisions are made faster, with greater confidence, and with less tolerance for doubt. That combination is lethal. I have seen it produce wars entered lightly and exited painfully, with intelligence later blamed for outcomes it warned about all along. The hard lesson is institutional and enduring. Intelligence cannot save policy from itself if it is not allowed to speak with independence and weight. When leaders demand reassurance instead of assessment, they are not just weakening analysis, they are dismantling their own early warning system. By the time the costs become visible, intelligence is already being tasked to explain failure rather than prevent it. One of the first things intelligence professionals learn is that actions speak loudly, but signals speak longer. When the United States declares an intention to run another sovereign country, that message is intercepted, decoded, and archived by every foreign intelligence service on the planet. It is not evaluated as a one-off statement. It is treated as precedent. I can say with confidence that allies, adversaries, and non-aligned states all hear something very different from what American officials intend them to hear. To allies, particularly in Europe and Latin America, the signal is unsettling. Intelligence reporting has long documented deep unease with unilateral U.S. action justified through flexible legal theories and moral framing. The Venezuela case reinforces a perception that American commitments to sovereignty are conditional and reversible. That matters. Allies plan their own security policies based not on American rhetoric, but on American patterns. When those patterns suggest that power will be exercised first and rationalized later, trust erodes quietly but decisively. To adversaries, the signal is even clearer. Russia, China, and Iran do not view this episode through the lens of Venezuela alone. They see confirmation that the United States reserves the right to redefine governance in weaker states when it suits its interests. Intelligence intercepts and open source analysis consistently show these actors using such precedents to justify their own actions. They do not need American permission, they need American examples. Each time Washington claims exceptional circumstances, it furnishes others with a ready-made script. Non-aligned states draw perhaps the most consequential conclusion. Many governments in Africa, Asia, and Latin America already operate under the assumption that international law offers limited protection against great power intrusion. When the United States openly embraces administrative control over another nation, it validates that skepticism. Intelligence assessments have long warned that this accelerates hedging behavior, states diversify security partnerships, deepen ties with rival powers, and reduce reliance on American guarantees. That shift is slow, but it is cumulative, and it is extremely difficult to reverse. What policymakers often miss is that credibility is not measured by strength alone. It is measured by predictability and restraint. Intelligence reporting repeatedly emphasizes that global influence depends on being seen as constrained by rules, not liberated from them. When American actions suggest otherwise, the damage is not confined to a single theater. It ripples outward, reshaping assumptions and strategies far beyond the immediate crisis. The hard lesson here is strategic humility. Intelligence can map how signals are received, but it cannot force leaders to care about second and third order effects. When power is exercised without regard for precedent, it may achieve short term objectives, but it weakens the very system that made that power effective. Over time, the world adapts not by confronting American dominance directly, but by quietly preparing for a future in which it is no longer trusted or needed. I have learned, often uncomfortably, that strategic collapse rarely announces itself as failure. It arrives disguised as confidence. Leaders speak with certainty, institutions move with momentum, and dissent is reframed as defeatism. By the time consequences become undeniable, the narrative has already shifted from prevention to damage control. The Venezuela episode, framed through the assertion that the United States will run another country, exposes that pattern in its most distilled form. The hard lesson is not about Venezuela alone. It is about how American strategy has come to substitute narrative for analysis. Intelligence was not absent in this case. The warnings existed. The risks were outlined. The historical parallels were unmistakable. What failed was not collection or capability, but the willingness to accept uncomfortable assessments when they conflicted with political ambition. When intelligence becomes something to be managed rather than heeded, its function collapses, even if its forms remain intact. What troubles me most is how familiar this trajectory feels. I watched it unfold in Iraq, where confidence replaced caution and assumptions replaced probabilities. I saw it in Libya, where a limited intervention metastasized into enduring instability. Each time, policymakers assured themselves that the context was different, that lessons had been learned, that this time control would be exercised without ownership of the consequences. Intelligence professionals knew better, but knowing is not the same as being heard. Declaring an intention to govern another country is the final step in abandoning strategic restraint. It signals not strength, but impatience with complexity. Intelligence teaches patience because it forces confrontation with reality rather than aspiration. When that discipline is discarded, power becomes blunt, legitimacy erodes, and credibility drains away incrementally until it is suddenly gone. This is not moral judgment, it is historical observation. The erosion of American credibility did not begin with Venezuela, and it will not end there. It is the cumulative result of decisions made with partial attention to intelligence and full confidence in narrative control. The world has adjusted accordingly. Allies hedge, adversaries test boundaries, and neutral states plan for a future in which American assurances are provisional rather than binding. Intelligence reporting captures this shift clearly. What remains uncertain is whether it will be acknowledged at the policy level. The final lesson is the one intelligence officers learn early and policymakers often learn late. Power divorced from realism is fragile. When intelligence becomes fiction, strategy becomes performance, and performance cannot sustain order. The collapse of the American strategic narrative is not a single event, it is a process, and it accelerates every time leaders choose reassurance over assessment. History will not be confused about this. The only open question is how much damage will be done before the lesson is finally absorbed.